Nene, fecha a porta, por favor.
Love you, bye.
Love you, bye.
Around two major challenges: recurring inflationary episodes and recurring financial crisis, and how to grapple with those issues.
Vou começar a traduzir.
And central bank independence and the mandates
Falando agora,
are institutions that are directed at meeting those
como
challenges.
vai ser o meeting? Vai ser em relação a
So as Beatriz reminded us in this morning, in the 1990s, there was a wave of institutional reforms in high-income economies when they adopted inflation targeting and were backed up by more legal legislated independence. So this concerns the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, Bank of Canada, the Riksbank, the Bank of England, plus ECB around the newly formed euro. And arguably, these reforms had their roots in the challenges of the 70s and 80s, high inflation, spurred on by large supply shocks and sustained by high inflationary expectations. So a first question for the panel: which were the main concerns behind the 1990s wave of central bank reforms in terms of practical policy experience and perhaps also academic thinking? And how much did these concerns reflect specific challenges of the 70s and 80s or more germane issues? Then we saw a downturn of inflation, and to many that looked like a major success, tolerable losses of output and employment. So the main policy challenges in the next few decades were instead to be about financial crisis, how to recuperate from the great financial crisis, how to stave off new ones, not least at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we got to see new financial regulation, QE, unconventional central bank intervention, and policy rates at record lows for a long time. So second question for the panel then is, which new concerns were raised by the events and challenges in the 2000s and the 2010s in handling financial crisis and deflationary pressures? And in particular, do these challenges suggest new trade-offs, for example, between monetary and fiscal policy, or between present macroeconomic outcomes and future financial stability? So if we look at today, superficially, the situation looks like a 70s, 80s redux with major supply shocks and emerging inflation inertia. So this brings us, I guess, to the most important and the bottom line question. Given the concerns behind the 1990s reform and the challenges in the next few decades, should we rethink central bank independence and central bank mandates? That is, are there good ideas or even concrete proposals for new reforms of central banking rules? Okay, so finally, the plan for the session. So we'll spend the next 20 minutes on initial remarks by each panelists.
remarks,
Then
com
we will have a
considerações de cada
discussion
dos
within the
panelistas,
panel
então eu
around
espero
these
que seja
initial
o
remarks
Jerome
for
Paulo seja
maybe
o
another
primeiro,
15
porque assim
minutes.
estava no schedule
And after that,
deles,
we'll
na
turn to a
agenda, vamos
round
ver.
of Q&A involving the audience. So think about
A gente vai fazer
questions
isso
and
até no
please
máximo
think
9h30,
about
porque o mercado
succinct
abre e a gente
questions
tem que correr
rather than
atrás
statements
do
beforehand and
trade.
try to relate them to the three major questions that I outlined. And in the last 5 minutes, panelists will be able to make some final remarks. Okay, so now let's go to the initial remarks, at most 5 minutes for each of you. I'm sure these remarks will span many aspects of the broad panel theme, but by agreement, each panelist will put more emphasis on one of the three main questions that I outlined. So Ken and Mervyn will touch on question number 1, Claudia on question number 2, and Jay on question 3. So without further ado, please, Ken Rogoff.
Só vai falar da question 3. Vamos ver, da última pergunta, que é a pergunta 3. Ele vai ser o último a falar. Vamos ver o que ele vai falar.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the organizers, to the Riksbank for inviting me to speak. I think you've heard so many remarks about Stefan. I can just summarize them by in the central banking community, he is regarded as a guru, that you don't know the answer, some hard question. He's a person you really can go to and get, very deep answer to, and we'll hear more about that as things go on. I've been asked to talk about some of the early developments, more the question 1
me pediram para falar sobre os primeiros desenvolvimentos política monetária do Fed no começo dos anos 90.
On this started in the 1980s,
dos
but of
80
course,
e nos 90.
really it goes back among practitioners far earlier than that.
Mas a verdade é que essas mudanças
an especially important event was
muito
the Fed Treasury
anteriormente
Report
aos anos 80.
in 1951 that
Desde
set up the Fed
1951,
to be an
onde
independent central bank back in
Banco
the
Central
1980s. That was a
foi
rarity.
feito,
Still,
foi desenvolvido,
the
foram novos que foram
Bundesbank had
desenvolvidos
achieved
para
that, but
atingir
most countries had not.
a Federal Reserve que a gente tem hoje.
My own contribution
A própria
was
contribuição
to develop a theoretical model
para conseguir
that
desenvolver
would try to
modelo
address
teórico
how it would work, why it
como
would work,
funcionaria a política
and it was
econômica
an
a partir desse
answer
momento.
to a very abstract question posed by Kydland and Prescott
E
and
foi uma
Barrow and
pergunta
Gordon about why
colocada
you
por
might
Kent
get
Prescott,
stuck
que era
in
uma
high
pergunta altamente
inflation and what you
teórica.
might want to do about it. My paper looked at
Eu escrevi
various
uma
ideas,
dissertação
including using an inflation
para responder
target,
essas perguntas através de uso de
appointing
mudanças de preço
people
deflacionário.
who already had a reputation for having a
Para fazer esse tipo de
strong
informação para pessoas que já tinham
anti-inflation
reputação
commitment. And needless
de
to say, I was very
entender
inspired by
esse
the
assunto.
great Paul Volcker, who I was working below, very,
Eu estava
very
trabalhando
far
com
below, but I
com
was
Paul
working
Volcker,
below Paul
era o
Volcker
Fed no
at the time
período,
when I was
eu estava
working on
bem
that.
abaixo
And
dele,
there's
obviamente.
been just tremendous amount of literature since taking this to many places. I think you're all familiar with
Acho que
Europe,
vocês
New
estão todos
Zealand, the United
familiarizados
Kingdom, but I wanted to
com Nova
just
Zelândia
really
e o Reino Unido, mas
emphasize
eu queria
an
dar
area people don't
ênfase
think
numa
about
área.
as much, which are emerging markets. And Tobias
Eu queria falar
Adrian
realmente para
really
vocês sobre os
spoke
mercados
about this, but I
emergentes,
still think most people don't quite
e
understand
que eu acho que a maioria das pessoas ainda não
about
consegue
the
entender
efficacy of the concept,
sobre
about how
a eficácia desse
important it is.
conceito.
European emerging markets, if
Mercados
you looked in
emergentes,
1992,
nos anos
there were
90
40
92,
countries with inflation over 40%.
tem mais de
That
40
doesn't even
países
capture
com
things because
inflação
a lot
acima
of
de,
them
acho que
had
foi em torno de
hyperinflations at the time.
1000%, eu não peguei essa.
And
Mas era
to
de
get out of
hiperinflação.
it, the early solution that was tried
Para
in
sair
many
dessa
places for a
solução
long time was,
primária no
well, the
começo,
dollar's really good, or
olhando para
let's
a
fix our
variação do dólar,
exchange
que
rate
estava muito
against
boa
the
na época
dollar,
para eles.
and that was very good for those of us that want to study financial crises.
E
But on the
a
whole,
variação do
didn't
dólar estava
work so
muito boa,
well.
foi um momento muito bom para quem queria estudar sobre esse tipo de assunto naquele
There was
momento.
really this period of
Então foi
transformation
período de
where
transformação
some very bold emerging
onde
market central bankers
bancos
got the
centrais,
idea,
os
it
banqueiros, os
worked in
líderes dos
advanced
bancos centrais
countries,
tiveram
let's
ideias
do it here. And I would
mirabolantes.
I think there are many, but I would single out Arminio Fraga in Brazil,
Principalmente Arminio Fraga do Brasil,
in Mexico, for example.
E também no
And
México.
I think people forget, but when they were trying this, people thought, this is ridiculous. You know, you can't be independent in these countries with these weak institutions. And the IMF also over time really played a very positive role here in pushing the idea. By 2015, inflation was actually very low across the world. It's not today, but even in places it seemed unimaginable, not just the former Soviet republics, African countries with inflation under 10%, even under 5%. And indeed, many people have forgotten, that central bank independence was ever needed. I invite them to read about Turkey, for example, where the president has fired central bankers the way Henry VIII changed wives, and you can see what's resulted there. I would say there are many refinements once you have an independent central bank of how to do it, and literature to which many people in this room have contributed. But I think the independence of the central bank is at the absolute central starting point to this. If you look at many of these emerging markets, they weren't really doing inflation targeting. They aren't really still doing inflation targeting, but they've used this as a device to establish their independence. Now, just to sort of summarize, I would also say there are so many things I didn't expect, and I just single out one. I'm surprised the extent to which central banks in everywhere almost are regarded as honest brokers. I mean, if you want to know what the data is, you go ask the central bank. And I think that's also part of this coming from independence. I think another thing which people in this room are very familiar with,
Outra coisa que as
but I
pessoas
think
aqui
it's very important, is the community
nessa sala são
of
muito
central
familiarizados,
bankers helping to support each
é
other,
que a
exchanging
ajuda que entre os
ideas,
bancos centrais
and there's been a
internacionais
huge
tem que ser
networking
ajudado.
effect in this,
E
in
criou network
providing ideas and also support.
para
When the whole
dividir
central
não só
banking
ideias, mas também
community
suporte.
stands behind you,
E como pessoas
a little bit,
estão te
your
ajudando
government listens. And
por
I
trás das
think we
cortinas.
can point at many examples of
Eu
that.
posso dar vários exemplos disso.
And then, certainly recently,
Com
the
certeza,
central
recentemente,
bank independence has been under attack.
a
I
independência do
certainly
Banco
don't think
Central
it's an idea,
tem
which
sido
is over
atacada.
at all. I would actually argue that
Eu diria
the
que
introduction of central bank independence has
a
been the
introdução
most
da independência dos bancos
significant
centrais
positive development
teve
in
desenvolvimento
macroeconomic policy
positivo
since the Second World War.
em
Thank you.
políticas econômicas depois da Segunda Guerra Mundial. Então vai agora, o Jay Paul vai ser o terceiro a falar, então não vai ser ele agora ainda. O mercado reagiu, a gente estava negativo no Dow, 150 pontos, agora está 114, então teve uma recuperação
Well,
bem.
Torsten, thank you, and good
Agradecendo,
afternoon,
boa
everyone.
tarde a todos.
Torsten's given us 5 minutes only, so I
Torsten
shall
só deu
reserve my
5
stories about Stefan and the
Eu recebi só 5
resurrection of the
minutos,
British
então eu
banking
não vou
system
limitar a
in
contar as histórias que eu
2009
contaria
to
sobre
conversation over
Stefan.
dinner. I think it is impossible to understand the
Eu acho
movement
que é
towards
impossível
central bank
entender
independence
o
without seeing
movimento
it in the
da
context
independência de
of the
bancos
great
centrais
inflation of the
sem
1970s
entender o combate
and
à
also
inflação
the
dos anos
stagflation of the
90
1980s.
e a inflação
The
galopante
former
dos
was the
anos 80.
consequence of, I think, in large part, an intellectual mistake
Foi
at the
mais,
time
eu acredito que esse
in
período foi
thinking that there was a
erro
long-run
intelectual mais
trade-off
do que qualquer outra
between
coisa,
inflation and unemployment, so
que
that
refletiu não
tolerating
só
a
na inflação,
somewhat
mas
higher
também
rate of
nos
inflation
níveis de desemprego
would
do
make it
momento.
possible to sustain a lower level of unemployment. But following the breakdown of Bretton Woods and the link to gold and two large oil price shocks,
Depois do aumento de preços
discretionary monetary
dos
policy
valores de
led to rates of
petróleo
inflation
e diminuição,
well
aumento
into double
muito
digits,
considerável
and in
de
some cases, such as the
desemprego, e no
UK,
caso de
above
óleo, aumento de
20%.
2 dígitos,
And as
foi
Ken
bem
said,
considerável,
in many emerging markets,
e
even
principalmente para
higher
mercados
still.
emergentes.
And the stagflation of the
E a
1980s
stagflation,
was the
estagflação,
painful
foi a
consequence
consequência
of efforts to
dolorosa
reduce
de todo
inflation,
tipo
which led to recessions,
de
while
esforço feito para
inflation
diminuir
still
a inflação,
remained relatively high.
enquanto a inflação continuava
Now, an
realmente
intellectual
relativamente
revolution
alta.
in macroeconomics undermined the belief in
Então, na
this
verdade,
long-run
que a
trade-off
parte
between
intelectual de
inflation
macroeconômicos ela
and
diminuía a
employment
probabilidade
and helped to restore the case
disso que isso acontecesse, mas de fato a gente se provou que ajudou a diminuir a inflação no decorrer do tempo.
Maynard Keynes in his tract of monetary reform.
Perdi esse último.
But the attempt to achieve it after the
A tentativa
breakdown
de
of Bretton Woods by
conseguir
rigid exchange rate
diminuir
links
o
collapsed
nível
in
inflacionário
1992 with the departure from the exchange rate mechanism in
desde
Europe of both the UK
desistiram
and
de
Italy,
fazer
and the end
uma
of the
mudança
fixed exchange rate links in Sweden,
exchange rate, não sei
where
dizer como
interest
seria
rates
isso
had
exatamente.
been, some of us remember, hard to think of this now, raised to 500%.
E que é difícil para a gente
And
pensar isso,
the
mas
same
em alguns
applied
casos você
to
teve aumento
Finland.
inflacionário de até 500%.
Now, politicians drew two conclusions
Então, os políticos eles
from the
chegaram a duas
unhappy
conclusões
experience
dessa
of the
experiência
70s
dos
and
anos
80s.
70.
First,
A primeira,
inflation was unpopular.
inflação era altamente
If
não era
exchange
popular.
rates were to float, therefore,
Se
then a
os
domestic
níveis
framework was
continuassem
needed to ensure price
naquele tipo
stability.
de mesmos
And that
níveis,
framework was the adoption of inflation
é que
targets.
não era sustentável e o
And
framework, ou
second, the
o
measures
plano
required to eliminate
foi
inflation
eliminar a inflação. E
were also
o
deeply
segundo foi eliminar a
unpopular,
inflação,
with high rates of unemployment for a
porque
while.
existia um período,
So
ia ter um
politicians
período
found
muito
that
grande,
setting interest
um período
rates
pelo menos
wasn't
considerável
actually much fun.
de desemprego, que deveria
So
ser
why
combatido.
not give that power
Então, por que
to
não
an independent central bank
passar esse
with a
poder de
mandate set
resolução
by
econômica
Parliament?
para bancos centrais que
And
fossem
those two
independentes?
conclusions led
E as duas
governments around the
conclusões
world to give greater independence
foi
to their
que se
central
desse
banks.
uma
And in most
liberdade ainda
cases, this
maior para os
did go
bancos
hand
centrais
in
tomarem
hand
suas decisões.
with an inflation target.
Isso porque os
Now,
bancos
the
centrais
policy debates at the time in the 1990s
obrigados a
are, I
ter
think,
objetivo
helpful
em
in
relação à queda da
understanding the
inflação.
challenges to monetary policy today.
Que
But there are
que
three
consideraram
important
que
differences
facilidade para
between then
os problemas que a gente tem
and
em
now.
relação à
First,
inflação hoje.
in the 1990s,
Primeiramente,
the
nos anos
memory
90,
of the great inflation of the
a
1970s
memória da
still
grande
vivid.
inflação dos anos 80 estava
Today,
muito
there is almost
aparente.
no one below retirement age who
Hoje,
remembers
quase não
the
existe
peak
pessoa
inflation
nenhuma
of
abaixo da
almost
idade de
50 years ago.
aposentadoria, ou mais ou menos
And until recently, low inflation had
que
come
lembre
to be
disso.
taken for granted,
Que porque a gente teve um período
both
muito
by
grande de inflação muito
economists
baixa, as
who
pessoas simplesmente
mistakenly assumed
não consideram
that
e acham
inflation in the medium term was determined by the inflation
então
target,
que não
and by
consideram que
the
a inflação
public
pode
who had
continuar sendo um
stopped
problema.
thinking and talking about inflation. So the constituency for low inflation,
Então,
so widespread
o
in the
desejo para uma
1990s,
inflação muito
has
baixa é
been
tão grande
somewhat
hoje em dia
eroded.
que a lembrança do
Secondly,
passado
in the 1990s, the
desapareceu.
popular support for low inflation
E nos anos 80,
encouraged politicians to grant
o
independence to
objetivo de
central
baixar a
banks
inflação foi com que
and
alguns políticos
to support
corajosos
them when it was necessary to raise interest rates.
eles dessem o
I think
apoio
today
deles no
governments can
sentido de
see only too
aumentar as taxas
clearly
de juros com o
the
objetivo de
challenge
baixar a
of
inflação.
issuing substantial quantities of government debt when interest rates are rising
E que
and central banks
refletia
are no
em
longer
níveis
buying
altíssimos de
their debt.
débito dos governos federais.
So external pressures on central
Então,
banks are, I
pressões
think, much
externas
greater now
dos
than in the
governos,
simpler
na verdade,
days
que ele está
of
falando,
the
são muito maiores hoje
1990s.
do que elas eram naquele período.
And third, when they were
terceira coisa,
introduced, and I think this is in some ways
E
the
quando
most
isso foi
important point,
introduzido, talvez seja mais
inflation
importante,
targets were not seen as a theory of inflation.
os objetivos
But
inflacionários,
today, in the models
eles não eram
currently
vistos como uma
fashionable
teoria
in
de inflação.
academia and used by central
Mesmo
banks,
os
the inflation target
professores
is the
universitários,
variable that closes the model
a variação da
and
inflação era a
determines the
variável
path of inflation in the medium
mais
term.
importante que fosse resolvida no
But the original
prazo,
aim of
no médio
inflation
prazo.
targets was actually to focus and change
Mas o mais
the
importante
way
é que tivesse
decisions on
uma
monetary policy were made.
mudança nas políticas econômicas
That is why inflation targets were
é mais
accompanied
sólida. Por isso
by
que
measures.
os objetivos de inflação
Your gift is the strongest thing I've ever felt.
comercial,
For the first
no meu
time in
canal,
my
não
life,
tem
I know
esse
who I am.
deles. That's not cool.
Curious about Botox Cosmetic? Book a consultation today.
Bem considerável agora.
By central bankers mumbling and saying very little,
Então, tem
they
voltado
were
aqui
set
muito
out
tempo.
clearly in speeches, evidence to parliaments, and reports such as the Bank of England's inflation report. And although these innovations remain,
Meio que essas inovações
I worry
continuam,
that model builders have tried to use the inflation target
eu tenho medo que
as a theory,
quem cria os
of what drives
modelos
inflation.
de inflação
because
sejam
as a
mudados
result,
e
any deviation of
continuem
inflation
com
from
aumento
target
inflacionário.
is assumed to be transitory.
Porque a gente sempre que as pessoas assumem que inflação é nada mais
So I conclude really that an analysis of why many central banks were granted independence in the 1990s, along with the adoption of inflation targets, is clearly relevant to understanding today's challenges.
Pontos de inflação.
Thank you.
Não é uma boa referência para você entender os problemas inflacionários. Well, não é o Paulo ainda.
Thank you very much, Thorsten. Thank you very much to the organizers, and
Obrigado
I was very honored to be invited here to speak on this panel on the occasion of the farewell of Stefan Ingves. For me, when I joined the ESRB, the European Systemic Risk Board, he was one of the founding fathers. He was already there, and I actually learned a lot from him in terms of the relevance of financial stability for monetary policy, the importance to need to act when it's needed, and the importance of clarity in communication. And I'm saying this not to break the rules, because actually rules are important, and that's going to be one of my main points here, but I'm saying this because I think this is all crucially important at the current juncture. As we just heard, I think in some sense central banks have enjoyed a capital of inattention or rational inattention to price and financial stability.
Nesses últimos anos,
Very low inflation and moderated risks to financial stability, so the public didn't actually pay much attention to central banks or mandates. But current macroeconomic developments, not just cyclical but also structural, really challenge price and financial stability. So explaining central bank independence and acting accordingly has become more difficult and also more important. Central bank independence is certainly protected by institutional safeguards. We just heard that. And that actually includes fiscal and macroprudential policy frameworks. But I think we also need to be very accountable. We need clear communication to sustain public support to independence. So let me explain these points quickly. Obviously, as been mentioned, inflation and risks to financial stability have been low, so the public in some sense could safely delegate the task of price and financial stability to technocrats and central banks and pay relatively limited attention to the details. Now, this has changed. That's my second point. So we have, first of all, inflation, which is well above targets of central banks today, and it's one of the main concerns of the general public. I looked at the most recent Eurobarometer poll, and there 42% of the respondents, and I think that's actually on the low side, rising prices as the most important concern, and actually that ranks above issues like energy supply and the international situation. And I would argue that actually concern about high levels of prices and perceived inflation is going to remain even if and when inflation rates recede. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is that during periods of low interest rates, vulnerabilities in the financial system have built up. In Germany, to give an example, we've had 2 decades of declining corporate insolvencies, very low credit risk, strong support to the real economy and indirectly also to the financial system through fiscal and monetary policy. And that, we think, leads to an underestimation of macroeconomic risk going forward, and also the expectation of further policy support. So higher vulnerabilities in the financial system is the second vulnerability. The third, we have high levels of debt, and that creates tensions between fiscal and monetary policy. And that's my third point. It's important, but also more difficult to actually explain the role of central bank independence and to act accordingly. So one tension, one conflict of interest that can arise in the short term is that there can be pressure on central banks to keep interest rates too long for for longer to avoid
por
risks to
período
financial
maior, para
stability, but I think
poder
this
a
even
pressão
makes
ela é devida ao objetivo de
increases
políticos de
vulnerabilities in the financial
facilitar
system. So if we
políticas
delay the
econômicas.
necessary monetary adjustment, that can lead
Que
to
não
the
é
buildup of
necessariamente o
further
melhor tipo de ajuste
vulnerabilities.
monetário para os bancos
And I
centrais.
think if we look back to the
Mas se a
global
gente olhar
financial
para
crisis,
trás,
we have seen how monetary
a crise
policy
financeira dos anos
can actually
2008,
come up,
2009,
be at risk to come under fiscal or financial dominance.
a gente entende
So at the
que isso
time
veio
of the
sobre
crisis, central banks
política
provided
fiscal dominante
liquidity to stressed financial institutions
que
and
colocou
often to
estresse muito grande
institutions
nas
with potential
instituições
solvency
financeiras.
problems. Capital buffers in the financial sector were insufficient and fiscal funds were
Mas essa
ultimately
política
needed
foi
to cover
insuficiente para
losses.
poder manter.
What are the lessons from this
Quais são as
episode?
lições que a
Well, we
gente
need
aprendeu nesse
sufficient
período?
capital buffers in the private sector.
Pro
Gaps in the institutional framework needed to be closed, so resolution
Então,
frameworks have been
buracos que
certainly
tinham nas
high on the
políticas das
agenda.
próximas corporações tiveram que ser
And
fechadas.
independence and credibility of central bank also
Independência e
may
a
come under
credibilidade dos
threat if
bancos
there are
centrais
insufficient fiscal
não
backstops.
foi suficiente até aquele momento.
Now, a lot has happened in the meantime.
Muita coisa
We
aconteceu
have
desde
better
aquele
fiscal
período
and macroprudential frameworks, and that
e
help us to prevent
a estrutura
financial or fiscal
macroeconômica
or financial
mudou
dominance.
e conseguiu transformar
And
pouco
these
a
frameworks
dominância
are actually complementary to the
da política econômica dos
frameworks for
bancos centrais.
central bank independence that we've just heard about. Obviously, there's a lot of institutional
Tem muitas
safeguards to
instituições que agora
central bank
colocaram
independence.
safeguards ou
In Europe, primary law assigns
pontos de
a strong
referência para
role to
você poder
central
se
bank
proteger,
independence, and the legal basis in the euro system is even
inclusive
stronger
por problemas
than in Germany.
legais que
So
foram
changing the
evitados
treaty
por
would
conta desse tipo
require
de mudança de
unanimity
política.
versus simple majority when it comes to changing the Bundesbank law in Germany. Maybe just as an interesting side remark, there's interesting historical research showing how independence was
Interessante que mostra que a
made into
independência
the legislation in
na
Germany,
legislação na
and when
Alemanha,
independence was discussed in
essa
the
independência do
40s
Banco
and
Central
50s, there was actually stronger
nos anos
support for
40
independence by the
existia
US authorities
suporte
than by
muito
the
grande
German
sobre
authorities.
em relação à independência dos bancos
Obviously, it's
centrais.
different when it comes to financial stability.
É diferente quando
The
você está
frameworks,
falando
the macroprudential frameworks that we have to
estabilidade
consider
financeira,
that the time horizon for financial stability risks
porque
is
o
different than for monetary
horizonte para a
policy.
estabilidade
Financial
financeira
cycles
esperada é realmente sempre
last longer
diferente.
than business cycles. The policy objectives are different. It's
Os
more
objetivos políticos
difficult
também são
even to
diferentes.
quantify financial stability than this is the case for price stability.
E se esse for o
And we have
caso para a
different types of
estabilidade
instruments.
financeira de
But
preço,
still, we need also independence for financial
por isso que a gente
stability
continua
policies,
precisando de
as we've
independência
also
dos
heard
bancos
from
centrais. Como a
Tobias,
gente já ouviu,
to avoid inaction bias and to avoid that we
para evitar
authorities come under fiscal pressure.
algum tipo de
The
pressão
last point I
externa.
would like to make is
E a
also
última
something
parte
that
eu queria,
colleagues have mentioned. Legal
alguns meus
frameworks
colegas já
are not
mencionaram,
sufficient. We have to
a
communicate
gente
and
tem
to
que
explain
comunicar,
independence.
explicar essa
And this can
independência.
actually be quite a balancing act. So we have on the one
Então,
hand the technical
existe
experts
equilíbrio entre a parte
to which we
técnica,
have to explain our policy cycle, where we
a gente pode
evaluate our
explicar nossas
policies, the
políticas, os
intended
ciclos
and unintended
econômicos,
consequence
os
of
ciclos das
policy
nossas
choices.
políticas,
But these policy
mas
evaluations are rather
essas
technical and tuned to an
essas
expert
políticas são muito
audience.
técnicas.
But at the same time, we need
Ao
to
mesmo
convince the
tempo,
general public
a
that the
gente tem que
central bank
convencer o
acts
público
in its best interest and
que o que a gente
protects
está
the
fazendo é
public
para o
with
melhor interesse deles
stability.
e poder trazer estabilidade.
So we need a translation from the
A
language
gente
spoken by
precisa
the
fazer uma
technocrats
tradução
to
da
the
parte
language
técnica
spoken by the general public, but we
para
don't
trazer para a
have
língua
established
que as pessoas realmente
dictionaries for
conseguem
that.
entender.
So one tool that the Bundesbank is using is
Uma
actually a
das
small video.
ferramentas que o
It's like
Bundesbank,
a
que é o banco
comic
alemão,
strip explaining why financial stability
são
is
desenhos, são
not
como
boring.
quadrinhos que
And
explicam
if you get the
para as
chance,
pessoas de um
take a
jeito
look at
mais
it and
simples
give us
como
feedback.
entender as políticas do Banco
And so I think
Central
we
alemão.
need this dialogue with the public in particular
A gente
because we live in a
precisa
time of structural
ter
change
essa
and we need to
comunicação com o
understand what's
público
going on around us,
para
and
que essa
so we need a
estrutura
lot of
possa ser entendida
communication channels also to the general public.
ao
Thank
público
you
em
very
geral.
much.
Muito obrigado. O mercado, que estava super negativo, começa devagarinho a voltar. A gente estava 150 pontos no Dow, um ponto, a gente está menos 51 pontos no Nasdaq, menos 26. Agora o homem, J. Powell. Eu queria agradecer pela amizade, por seu amigo, por ser uma pessoa essencial no nosso mundo. Eu vou usar meus comentários.
This is
Não, please, sério. Eu tenho red nessa minha conta minha conta do YouTube, exatamente tudo que não aconteceu. Vou dar isso aqui.
effective oversight by the public and their elected representatives in Congress. Third,
terceira coisa,
we should stick to our
nós
knitting
devemos
and not
sempre
wander off to pursue
não
perceived social
sair
benefits
muito
that are
do
not
nosso
tightly
política
linked to
original
our statutory goals and
e
authorities.
manter só os nossos
So
objetivos
starting with the
e
first point,
autoridade. Então, pelo primeiro, vamos começar pelo primeiro.
as Ken and others have pointed out, on the
Como
first
outros
point, the case
disseram.
for monetary policy independence
E o caso
lies
para a
in the
independência
benefits of
monetária,
insulating monetary policy decisions from
independência
short-term political considerations.
para a gente conseguir não
Price
estar
stability is the
pressionado pela
bedrock
pressão
of a healthy
política de
economy
curto
and
prazo.
provides the public with immeasurable benefits
O que a
over
gente
time.
pode
But
providenciar para o
restoring
público
price stability when inflation is high
benefício
can
muito longo.
require measures that are not popular in
Mas
the
às vezes
short term as
as
we
medidas que a
raise
gente tem que
interest
tomar não
rates
são
to slow the
populares.
economy. The absence of direct political control over our
A
decisions
ausência de
allows us to take these
controle
necessary
político
measures
interno
without considering short-term
sem
political factors.
considerar
And I
os
believe that the
resultados de
benefits of
curto prazo
independent monetary policy in the United States and
trazem
more broadly around
resultados
the world are well
benéficos nos Estados
understood
Unidos
and broadly
que
accepted.
ainda não são entendidos. Acho que
However,
não
in
são
a
entendidos.
well-functioning democracy, important public
São
policy
uma
decisions
função da
should be
democracia.
made in almost all cases by the elected branches of government.
Que independente
Grants
dos
of independence to agencies like ours should be
ramos
exceedingly
de
rare,
governo que foram
explicit,
votados, que as políticas
tightly
econômicas sejam
circumscribed, and limited
trabalhem
to
para o
those
benefício da
issues that
população.
clearly warrant protection from short-term
E que
political
exista um tipo de
considerations.
proteção para o tipo de pressão que
With
é
independence
feito
comes the
para resultados de
responsibility to
curto prazo.
provide the transparency that enables effective
E a
oversight in our case
transparência
by Congress,
que tem que
which
ser
in turn supports the Fed's democratic
normalizada para que as pessoas
legitimacy.
consigam.
And at the Fed, we treat this
E no
as an
Banco
active,
Central
not
Americano,
a passive
a
responsibility.
gente trata isso com
Over the
responsabilidade
past
muito
several
grande.
decades, we've steadily
Durante
broadened
muitas
our efforts
décadas,
to provide meaningful
a
transparency
gente, o
about the
objetivo
basis
foi
for and the
passar
consequences of the decisions that we
informações de um
make
jeito
in
transparente
service to the American people.
para servir o público
We are
americano.
tightly focused
A
on
gente está
achieving our
muito
statutory
focado em
mandate
chegar aos nossos
and on
pontos,
providing
nossos
useful and
objetivos
appropriate transparency.
de um jeito transparente.
On the third point,
O terceiro ponto.
it is essential that we stick to our
É
statutory goals and
essencial que a gente
authorities
continue com
and that
nossos
we resist the
objetivos
temptation to broaden our
e
scope
que a gente
to
resista à
address
tentação
other important social issues of the day.
de tentar
Taking on
resolver os
new
problemas
goals,
sociais do
however
momento,
worthy, without
porque
a clear statutory mandate would undermine the
objetivo
case for our
digno,
independence.
que a gente
In
consiga
the
manter
area,
nossa
in
independência
the
e nossos
area of bank
objetivos
regulation,
eventualmente.
as Tobias mentioned, the Fed has a degree of independence, as do the other
O
federal
Banco
bank
Central Americano
regulators.
tem grau de dependência.
Independence in this area helps ensure
A
that the
independência
public
que a
can be
gente tem nessa
confident
área é
that
que
our
o público
supervisory
tenha
decisions
confiança
are
de
not
que
influenced by political
nossas
considerations.
políticas não são
And
influenciadas
today,
por decisões políticas.
some analysts ask
Mesmo
whether
hoje, alguns
incorporating
analistas
into bank supervision the
se perguntam
risks
sobre o tipo de
associated
supervisão
with climate change
que o banco
is
recebe,
appropriate,
por exemplo,
wise,
como
and
por
consistent
exemplo,
with our existing mandates.
mudanças climáticas, que podem ser mudanças
Addressing
de
climate
em relação
change
à
seems
pressão
likely to
política para algum
require
tipo de
policies
política.
that would have significant distributional and other effects on companies, on
Como
industries,
as
on
políticas
regions,
podem
and on
ter reflexo não
nations.
só em
Decisions about
empresas,
policies to directly address
em
climate
pessoas
change
também.
should be made by the elected branches of government and
E
thus
algumas
reflect
decisões
the
que estão
public's
relacionadas com a
will
economia, algumas
as
decisões
expressed
elas
through
têm que ser
elections.
resolvidas pelos
At the same
órgãos
time, in my view, the
governamentais.
Fed does have a narrow but
Mas o
important
Banco Central tem
responsibilities
uma
regarding
responsabilidade bem narrow,
climate-related
bem
financial
definida.
risks. These responsibilities are tightly linked
As
to our responsibilities for
responsabilidades
bank supervision.
são as
The
responsabilidades que são
public
muito próximas
reasonably
das
expects
nossas
supervisors to
responsabilidades em
require
relação
that banks
ao sistema
understand
bancário americano.
and can appropriately manage their material risks, including the
E a gente
financial
pode,
risks
de
of
um jeito,
climate change.
mitigar os riscos
But without
relacionados.
explicit congressional legislation, it would
Então,
be
as
inappropriate for us
leis
to use our monetary policy or supervisory tools,
entender de
for
novo.
example, to promote a greener economy
Exemplo,
or to achieve
como a
other
gente pode
climate-based goals.
dar um suporte, não
We
suporte,
are
vamos dar um
not,
suporte
and
nas
we will not
políticas
be,
econômicas, por
a
exemplo,
climate policy maker.
de uma economia mais sustentável. Bom, basicamente ele não falou nada relacionado com política econômica momentânea. O mercado vai abrir agora. Então eu vou parar por aqui. A gente vai continuar. A gente vai começar a fazer trades no Discord. Se você gostou desse broadcast, deixe o seu like, deixe o seu comentário. Se você continuar assistindo, eu vou deixar o link aqui. A gente está na hora de abrir o mercado e mix. Bom dia para todos.
Initial remarks, especially if you have views on desirable